Tonight, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. We've entitled our talk here tonight, Stop the Grave Robbery. Why are we saying that? Let me ask you a question. How many of you have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer? Pretty much everybody in here. And he's most famous for, not his books, The Cost of Discipleship. You know?
No, that's Jim. I'm trying to get into the lunch.
I was going to say, the last time they recorded this,
That's good.
that's a little.
I just wanted to
Joel has to
That's
see. At least if he's me, he does.
What a crime it was, and for a second there, no one could see me. What a loss to humanity. Perhaps not. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is not best known necessarily for his books, The Cost of Discipleship or Life Together, but he's best known, of course, for his role in a plot to kill a duly elected leader of a major Western power. Oh, thank you. Did you set it up here, Ryan?
I didn't bring one. I forgot it.
Excuse me for a second. Pull towards you to turn on, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's working. I heard a quote as I came here tonight, and this is the core of what we want to get to tonight, because Dietrich Bonhoeffer, everybody says he's a great man. You know, it's kind of like Martin Luther King Jr. now, right? Nobody's going to say anything bad about Martin Luther King Jr. Nobody's going to say anything bad about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Great guy. But if Dietrich Bonhoeffer doesn't have anything to teach us today, then what good is he? He's just another tomb to whitewash. Another person to praise in the past with no lessons for us whatsoever today. Heard an interesting quote tonight as I was coming over tonight. Listen to R.J. Rushdoony. He was talking about the influence of Richard III and Oliver Cromwell on England. And he quoted a Marxist professor, and this is what he said. This Marxist professor talking about the influence of the Puritans. And this is what he said, Marxist professor. He said, "A century of Bible reading is not easily forgotten." And what he meant was, these Puritans were not able to be collared. They were not able to be intimidated. They had ideas of law, government, politics, criminal justice, education. For them, the Bible wasn't just a devotional book. I mean, come on now, can we talk? How many times have we cracked the Bible open for a devotional thing, little devotional inspiration, and 20 minutes later we couldn't even remember what we read? How often does that happen? That wasn't the book for the Puritans. It was, this book tells us how to live. This is one of the reasons why we have it. It doesn't just tell us how to get to heaven. We're not in heaven yet. It tells us how we're supposed to live on earth as well. And I thought about that quote. A century of Bible reading was not easily dismissed from a Marxist professor. We feel like we're being overrun today by wickedness. Do we have a century of Bible reading under our belt in the Church of Jesus Christ today? Are we like overwhelmed with biblical literacy and biblical knowledge? I would have to argue not hardly. So stop the grave robbery. The lessons and legacy of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I'm going to tell you where I'm going with this right at the front. And then you can listen through that particular filter, if you will, and you can challenge me at the end if you'd like. You know, that's one of the good things about starting late. There's going to be no time. Just kidding.
We'll make time.
Definitely just kidding. Here's my thesis tonight that I hope to present, and I hope to present it a few ways. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is praised by our churchmen today. These are the same churchmen that tell us the church may not speak to the social or the political sphere. Can't do it. Because, you know, we just have to get out there and win souls. So if that's the case, then let's put Dietrich Bonhoeffer where he belongs, in some sort of a glass case somewhere, and say, you know what? The poor guy, he went out and he got himself killed. He went out and he tried to kill Hitler. What was he thinking? He should have been out saving souls. See, we can't have it both ways, folks. You can't have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the hero, that tried to do something about a wicked man, and then say, on the other hand, that it's not the job of the church to speak to the social and political sphere. One or the other. It's time to make that decision. I want to talk briefly about Bonhoeffer here. I want to talk also briefly about a man named Paul Schneider. How many here have heard of Paul Schneider? A few of you have. I want to talk briefly about Schneider. Schneider was killed in Buchenwald. Now, Bonhoeffer spent a little bit of time in Buchenwald, but he was not killed there. He was killed in Flossenburg. Paul Schneider, when he was killed, according to Eric Metaxas, whose book I'm going to be quoting from extensively tonight, Eric Metaxas' book, Bonhoeffer, Pastor, Martyr, Prophet, Spy. When he heard that Paul Schneider had been killed, it was at that point that Dietrich Bonhoeffer felt that there was no fixing the situation. I want to talk briefly about Paul Schneider, murdered in 1938 in Buchenwald. He was a pastor that personally took on two of Hitler's favorite public figures. See, he didn't, and this is why he got in such trouble. He wasn't a modern guy. You know, Hitler never really had a problem. And he said this again, he never really had a problem. He said, you churchmen take care of the church, and we'll take care of everything else. How many of our churchmen would agree with that?
Sure, no problem.
You know, you handle the state, you handle the society, we'll just keep our little thing inside the church. And Pastor Paul Schneider wouldn't do it. And this is what he did. He realized the attacks on the church in the early 30s, back when most of the population was all excited about the new savior of the world, whose name happened to be Adolf Hitler. What he did was he preached, but he didn't stop with that. He preached against two men who challenged him personally, and he challenged him back. One of whose name was Ernst Röhm. Ernst Röhm, you may or may not be aware, was Hitler's street thug, head of the brown shirts, a man whose job was to stir up trouble and kill people. Hitler, of course, got to come along at the end of Ernst Röhm's little career and be the guy to save everything, right? To be the guy to come up and say, you know what, we have too much anarchy going on, got to get rid of this guy Röhm. And they did. Well, Paul Schneider took on Ernst Röhm by name, and he just didn't preach against him in his church. He published his sermons and put them out on a post out by his church so that everybody could read them. Not only that, Alfred Rosenberg, if that name means anything, we usually think of of Goebbels. I always goof his name up, Goebbels, whatever his name was. That was Hitler's kind of like bumper sticker, if you will, his bumper sticker propaganda guy. You know, peace, jobs, freedom, whatever. You know, Rosenberg was his footnote guy. The book writer, the magazine guy, the intellectual, the smart guy. And Paul Schneider took on him as well and published his sermons about what Rosenberg was saying, published them outside his church. You see, Schneider was not willing to keep his theology and his Christianity inside the four walls of his church. And that's what got himself killed ultimately. Also, I just have to tell you this briefly, very briefly. But when Paul Schneider took on the Nazis, and that's exactly what he did. It's in the book, The Witness of Buchenwald. It's a very hard book to get. It's been translated out of German. I was able to get it in the interlibrary system. You can get the book. Very interesting book because they reproduce some of the communications that went on between the confessing church and the Nazis. And the confessing church ultimately wound up agreeing with the Nazis that they had to get rid of Paul Schneider because he's just too much of a problem. That's what happened towards the end. It's very chilling to read the communications between the two, agreeing, as they did, that this guy's a problem. You know, when Paul Schneider wound up getting kicked out of his church with the cooperation of his consistory, can you guess what Bible verses got quoted to him? Anybody want to just take a wild guess? Romans 13, yeah, you got to obey the authority, you got to obey the government. They're telling you to leave that church. Well, they weren't the only ones. He finally wound up in jail before he was murdered at Buchenwald. But when he first went to jail, the Nazis thought they could save him a little bit, talk some sense into his head. And they talked, and this is in the book of The Witness of Buchenwald, you can read about it. They would decide to talk a little theology with Pastor Schneider. Little theology, a little give and take. They didn't know a whole lot of theology, but guess what Bible verses they did know? Romans 13. Nazis quoting Romans 13. And they had the same take on Romans 13 as a lot of people do today. Now my friends, can I not ask this? If we are coming up with the exact same interpretation of Romans 13 as the Nazis, I don't know. Am I going out on a little bit of a limb here saying maybe we need to take a second look at our interpretation of that passage? Maybe. But we do. We do. Well, Dietrich Bonhoeffer heard about the murder of Paul Schneider. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to back up a little bit, had left Germany because he didn't want to be drafted. He felt that was the right thing to do. But let me just kind of pick up here from George Grant as a synopsis of what happened with Bonhoeffer. Lutheran theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer was transferred to the Nazis' terrible Buchenwald concentration camp on February the 7th, 1945. 3 months later, he was added to the list of the dead. He was hanged days before Allied Army forces freed Buchenwald, but he wasn't hung there. Safe in exile in America during the first part of Hitler's terrible reign, he had abruptly returned to Germany. And this is what he said. This is Metaxas' book also. I have come to the conclusion that I have made a mistake in coming to America. I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of the Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share in the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany face the terrible alternative of willing the defeat of their nation in order that civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make that choice in security. End of quote. So he knew what he was walking into. Well, to get to know him a little bit more, here is this is not on his gravestone, this is a church in Flossenburg, which says, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a witness of Jesus Christ among his brethren, born February 4th, 1906 in Breslau, died April 9th, 1945 in Flossenburg. This is a plaque on a church outside of Flossenburg. There's his dates again. He was associated with the, I hope I'm saying this right, Abwehr. Abwehr. Pastor John, you said Abwehr? Abwehr. That was the German military intelligence. How many of you have ever heard of Admiral Canaris? Okay, some of you have. He was the one that headed it up, and he personally protected Dietrich Bonhoeffer before and after he was arrested. Canaris was a brilliant man. I do not know his spiritual condition. He supported Hitler to the hilt at the beginning, but then turned on him later on, and was ultimately killed the same time as Bonhoeffer was. Okay. You might not know who this guy is, but I want you to look at that face and consider his statement. This is Metaxas now talking about Friedrich von Ravenau. Ravenau was known by Bonhoeffer in prison right at the end. And this is what Metaxas says about Ravenau. And I want you to think about this, please. This is just one sentence. He says, the 60-year-old Ravenau was a Christian whose faith led him to oppose Hitler early on. Is that a statement that could be written of any of us today? That our faith would lead us to oppose a political leader? Could we say that about any of us today? Or does our faith lead us to support anybody and everybody? I just ask you to consider that and reflect on that statement. This man was such a danger. He was also apparently killed in Flossenburg. He wasn't killed publicly, and there's a lot of controversy about how he was ultimately murdered. He had to be murdered in secret. He never did support Hitler. He retired, he resigned, and became a problem, and Hitler ultimately murdered him. His faith led him to oppose Hitler early on. Let me ask you, your faith, does that lead you to oppose anybody? Anybody? Our purpose for the study is the following: to get to know who he was, to understand the time in which he lived. It wasn't quite as easy as what we want to make it sometimes, very difficult times. To learn what motivated him. If we can find out what motivated him, now we can start to learn his lessons. To apply these lessons for today. I think we failed at that completely, frankly. And finally, to honor the memory of a courageous man. There's a lot of different people we can remember. Our brain's only so big. We might as well remember the ones worth remembering. His theology was practical. And here's where we're going to get to know Dietrich Bonhoeffer just a little bit. From Metaxas' book, listen to this. This is a sermon that his parents heard him preach. On September 23rd, this is early on, his parents heard their son preach on a theme central to him throughout his life, supporting the accurately earthly, incarnational aspect of the Christian faith against the Gnostic or dualistic idea that the body is inferior to the soul or spirit. God wants to see human beings, he said, not ghosts who shun the world. He said that in the whole world history, there is always only one really significant hour, the present. If you want to find eternity, you must serve the times. He would later presage what he said to his fiancée from his several years later. Our marriage must be a yes to God's earth. It must strengthen our resolve to do and accomplish something on earth. I fear that Christians who venture to stand on earth on only one leg will stand in heaven on only one leg too. Do you see what he's saying? He's not giving up eternity, but he's simply saying, hey, you know what, we're here now. Are we just like in a holding pattern? Are we in an incubator until we get raptured out of here or die? Or do we have a job to do while we're here? And of course his answer was, we have a job to do while we're here. Secondly, he absolutely understood the cultural vacuum. Once again, Metaxas, some good writing here, says this. For many, the rudderless squabbling of the current system, this is Weimar Germany now, pre-Hitler, was simply un-German. Many Germans longed for a return to some kind of leadership and were increasingly less fussy about what kind of leadership it should be. They wanted leadership itself and a leader who would lead. There was such a leader, but his party showing in the 1928 elections had been disappointing. He began working toward the next elections, focusing mainly on winning votes in rural areas. He would return at a more opportune time. You know, how many times have we Christians thought to ourselves, we just kind of need the right guy in power. If we can just get the right guy, a right up front guy, we're going to be all right. But I had a question for all of us. How are we going to know it when we see him? How will we identify that particular leader if he ever comes along? Who knows? We might decide that he's, here's a good word for you. You've heard this one before. Unelectable. Can't elect that guy. You know what Hitler had going for him? He was electable. What a guy. Dietrich Bonhoeffer understood the cultural vacuum. I just really don't have time to read all the sections from Metaxas' book. I hope you get a chance to read it. He refused to abstract the scriptures. Abstract the scriptures. Boy, have you ever been in that kind of discussion? I know I have. Here's where the Bible says something really specific and like, oh, you know, you don't understand the nuance. Oh, If I hear that word again, I'm going to strangle somebody. Yeah, Paul, nuance, this is nuance. Well, nuance this. In Luke chapter 3, here's some nuance for everybody. Luke chapter 3 and verse 19. Talking about the greatest man who ever lived, John the Baptist. You ready for this? Listen to this. But Herod the Tetrarch, being rebuked by him concerning Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and for all the other evils which Herod had done, also added this above all, that he shut John up in prison. Did you hear why John wound up in prison? He was a problem to a wicked, tyrannical king. You know, we often go to that and say, well, Herod threw him in prison because he rebuked Herod because of his brother's wife. And John did do that. He went to Herod and he said, you can't have your brother's wife. You can't do that. But Luke tells us a little bit more. It wasn't just Herod's wife that was a problem. Whenever, it says, for all the evils that Herod did. Listen again to this. Being rebuked by him concerning Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, and for all the evils which Herod had done. He didn't just rebuke him for one evil. Every time Herod was out there doing another evil, guess who was in his face? Up in his grill. The greatest man who ever lived. Ah, don't you love John? Where are our Johns? Oh, all our Christian leadership is bowing and scraping to the wicked people. No one's challenging them, or hardly anyone. John did. The greatest man who ever lived. Abstract that one, nuance that one. He rejected otherworldly pietism. He understood the threat of the hour. He worked with others who understood. He worked with generals, other politicians. He understood what was happening to the country. And he would not stand for it. He even preached, check this out, he even preached on the value of the Old Testament. Has anybody here ever heard of the Old Testament? Yeah, most of you have. Yeah, it's that book before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You know, sometimes it sneaks into some of our modern translations of the Bible because we sneak in Proverbs and Psalms with a New Testament translation, so we just grab a little bit of it and drag it on over. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked, and Metaxas talks about in his book, how that he understood that you could not understand the New Testament. You could not literally understand the New Testament unless you understood the Old Testament. How many times have you heard this? So many times. I don't know, dozens. Hey, Joel, but it doesn't say it in the New Testament. And I have to say, no, it says it in that other Bible. You know, the Old Testament. You know, we got two Bibles, right? Actually, once you start doing the two Bibles thing, there's no limit to the amount of Bibles you can have. Because then there's the red letter edition Bible. Have you ever run into that one? You know, well, Jesus did. Okay, then you show where it might say something that they don't appreciate in the New Testament. And then you know where they go right next? Well, Jesus never said it. Okay, so now we're just kind of, you know, have you noticed the Bible gets like smaller and smaller and smaller? It's all it really needs is red letters. But if you read the red letters carefully, what Jesus actually said, guess who was the biggest endorser of the Old Testament, quoting it 70 times? That would be Jesus Christ. Bonhoeffer understood it. He held deep convictions. You know he held deep convictions. How many of our, you know, I like to think that I hold convictions. But it's been said the real virtue that you need to have is courage. I might have convictions, but if when the time comes my convictions are challenged and I don't have the courage, where are my convictions at that moment? They're not convictions. Or they're not convictions worth much of anything. Not so with Bonhoeffer. He held them against very long odds. He was no wannabe, and he understood the complications that evil brings to those who oppose it. And let me just address that, if I may, from the text. This is his book. He says this. He says this is Bonhoeffer now talking. The great masquerade of evil has played havoc with all our ethical concepts. For evil to appear disguised as light, charity, historical necessity, or social justice is quite bewildering to anyone brought up on our traditional ethical concepts, while for the Christian who bases his life on the Bible, it merely confirms the fundamental wickedness of evil. Then he dismissed, this is Metaxas now, he says, then he dismissed the standard responses to what they were up against and showed why each would fail. Who stands fast, he asked. Only the man whose final standard is not his reason, his principles, his conscience, his freedom, or his virtue, but he who is ready to sacrifice all when he is called to obedient and responsible action in faith and in exclusive allegiance to God. He recognized the failure of anything but godly conviction when times really, really got tough. And that is the failure of anything else, because it all will fail. So why do we say stop the grave robbery? Because we live in a time when the contemporary church is not all that interested in preaching the whole counsel of God to society. The mantra goes something like this: we just preach the gospel, we don't get involved in anything else. Raise your hand if you've heard that. Almost sounds downright spiritual, doesn't it? Like, congratulations, you're out to preach the gospel. Well, what would we say to John the Baptist? Can't you just hear the lectures to John the Baptist today? Can't you just hear them? You don't even need imagination. Did you guys, overheard at the back of the church after the Sunday sermon last week? You hear what happened to John the Baptist? No, what happened? He's in jail. What'd he do? Something about Herod and his wife and the stuff that Herod said or John said he did. Well, what did he say? Well, he was up in Herod's face and he was telling him he couldn't have his brother's wife. And you and I both know he was always right down Herod's throat for all the other stuff he did. We know what's coming next. Why did he do that? I mean, he had to know he was going to get thrown in jail. What an idiot. Don't you think that's what we would lecture John the Baptist today? Okay, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit. A friend of mine just yesterday asked me, he said, he wanted to know about when to speak up and when not. And he said this, and this is all of our worry when it comes to the public square. We all worry about this. He said, well, I don't want to be a jerk. And so, of course, I said, I don't care if I'm a jerk. And here's why. A jerk is something that's culturally defined. Have you ever noticed that? The culture defines what a jerk is. If you haven't noticed, a jerk is anybody who believes the Bible. I'm already a jerk by definition. By George, I'm going to be a big one. Sin and righteousness is defined by the scriptures. Societal acceptance is defined by society and changes from time to time. Yeah, I really do believe, yes, that if we were looking at John the Baptist today, most of us would say, what an idiot. No wonder he's in jail. And how many would say, he got what he deserved? Very worrisome. Bonhoeffer had it figured out. There's a well-known preacher, I won't mention his name, who recently was called on the carpet because his organization took a particular stand as far as a cult was concerned. Decided that this particular cult, Mormonism, was no longer a cult. Took it off the website. And when challenged, said, well, we don't get involved in these kind of arguments. We just, help me finish it, preach the gospel. It wasn't but a few months after that that this same preacher was on the television arguing for background checks for people who want to buy a weapon. Whatever happened to just preach the gospel? Something's not right. Stop garnishing the tomb of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Here was a man, a pastor and theologian, that was more involved in the social political sphere than almost anyone else that you can possibly name. What are we going to do with this man? Stop the grave robbery, end the duplicity. Either learn from his example and speak to society from the scriptures, or identify Bonhoeffer as a distracted theological ideologue who lost his way, giving up the gospel for a misguided attempt to kill a duly elected leader of a major Western nation. Romans 13, anyone? One or the other. Can't do both. He was either a prescient, insightful man who knew what needed to be done and was willing to do it himself, or, as is said about some of our pastors during the colonial period, he was simply carried away by contemporary events and mistakenly thought that God, through the scriptures, expected him to act. What a goofy guy. He thought the scriptures called on him to act. What was he thinking? The same thing is now being said about some of the ministers of the Black Robe Regiment of our own colonial period. Same thing said about them. They got carried away, forgetting that they were the children and grandchildren of ministers who've been kicked around by Charles II. Not that long before. Not long before at all. Want to go out and get themselves killed with the parishioners? But they saw the threat. No third option here, my friends. Our purpose for the study, a brief study, we've only scratched the surface. To get to know who he was, understand the time in which he lived, learn what motivated him, apply those lessons for today, and to honor the memory of a courageous man. If we cannot apply his lessons for today, then why study?